Friends of Islam, this time the Islamic faith is back before you to share Islamic information. I hope it inspires your activities today. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and activate the bell button notifications so you don't miss the latest news from the Islamic Faith channel. A surprising story emerged from the scientific world when two scientists, one from Japan and the other from England, decided to embrace Islam after conducting in-depth research on the tomb of Abu Lahab, a figure known as the Prophet Muhammad's archenemy. The two scientists initially came with purely scientific intentions, seeking to discover historical facts and the condition of the bodies of important figures in Islamic history. However, what they discovered at Abu Lahab's tomb shook their faith. Facts beyond modern logic and science ultimately led them to one major conclusion: the truth of Islamic teachings. A Japanese archaeologist, Professor Hiroshi Tanaka, came to the Middle East to research the remains of ancient Arab civilization. He was known to be skeptical of religion, but possessed a great scientific curiosity. In his initially purely archaeological search, he discovered clues to the tomb of Abu Lahab, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who was known to hate Islam. What really happened? The Hijaz desert stretched desolately under a cloudless sky. The sun radiated a cruel heat, making every step on the sand feel like dragging the body into a giant furnace. In the middle of the arid desert, a white tent stood surrounded by modern survey equipment, field vehicles, and researchers busy with their work. Inside the main tent sat a Japanese man in his late 50s. Sharp-eyed but calm, wearing a field cap and a worn long-sleeve shirt, he was Professor Hiroshi Tanaka. Hiroshi was no ordinary man. He was a renowned archaeologist from Kyoto University, known for his rigorous approach to logic and empirical evidence. For more than 3 decades, he explored the ruins of ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the Indus Valley. But the Hejaz was a region he had never touched, too close to religious symbols, which he felt obscured historical data. For him, religion and science were two paths that should not cross. But an ancient manuscript he found in an Istanbul library changed everything. It was written in ancient Arabic with ink that was almost faded. Hiroshi read it with the help of a local translator named Yusuf. Among the geographical descriptions and ancient tribal records was a description of an unremembered tomb buried beneath the wrath of the heavens belonging to a cursed enemy of the prophet. Hiroshi was intrigued not by its spiritual content, but because the seemingly metaphorical phrase turned out to be accompanied by rough coordinates and climate records that could be matched with modern data. That night, under the light of a gas lamp and the tent walls buffeted by the desert wind, Hiroshi stared at a relaminated map of the ancient Hejaz. He marked points that matched the manuscript's instructions. "If this is true," he murmured, staring at the rough coordinates that formed a pattern in the southwest, "then we haven't just found a tomb. We might be touching a forgotten piece of history." Yusuf entered with 2 cups of tea. "Hot. Mr. Tanaka, the night is getting colder, and you're not sleeping anymore." "I can't," Hiroshi replied, staring at the map. "This map and the record of a man hated by the heavens. Who is he, really?" Yusuf stared at the map and sat down. "In Islam, there is a figure named Abu Lahab. He was the Prophet Muhammad's uncle, but also his sworn enemy. The Quran even has a special chapter dedicated to him, the chapter Abu Lahab." Hiroshi turned his head quickly. "The chapter of the Holy Book mentions one person specifically." Yusuf replied, then took out his phone and began to read aloud. "Perish the hands of Abu Lahab, and indeed he will perish. His possessions and his efforts will be of no avail to him. One day he will be thrown into a raging fire." Hiroshi took quick notes. For him, this wasn't about religion, but the opportunity to investigate how an ancient text could record someone so specifically. He wanted to know if someone like Abu Lahab really existed. Could his tomb still be found? And could the manuscript's notes refer to the same person? The next day, the team headed to a marked area about 50 kilometers from the ancient city of Taif. The area wasn't marked on modern maps, but satellite data indicated an anomaly in the terrain beneath the surface. Perhaps the remains of a buried stone structure? They set up camp nearby and began surveying with ground-penetrating radar. Several days passed without success. The desert winds whipped up, burying the equipment in sand, making the work doubly difficult. Hiroshi was growing frustrated, but a strange signal from the ground-sensing device stopped all his complaints. At a depth of about 2 meters, a narrow rectangular space was detected. The structure was clearly artificial, not a natural formation. "This could be a tomb," Hiroshi said. His voice choked with excitement and anxiety at the same time. The work began more seriously. They dug carefully, clearing away the sand layer by layer. Old stones began to emerge. Most were engraved but eroded by time. On one side, they found a small inscription in ancient Arabic script. Yusuf tried to read it, though some parts were missing. Here rested the cursed one. His hands were shackled by wrath. Hiroshi froze. He knew he had just opened the door to something greater than ordinary ruins, but he also began to sense something strange. He didn't believe in superstition, but the air around the excavation pit felt different. The air grew colder, the wind died down, and the local workers began whispering about curses. But Hiroshi didn't back down. He had never been so close to a discovery that could change everything. That night, he gazed at the stars from outside his tent. The desert was silent again, but a voice echoed in his chest. It wasn't Japanese, nor was it Arabic, but a voice of curiosity that was beginning to mix with something he had previously thought was missing. The conviction that perhaps, just maybe, he was on the trail of a truth that was more than just scientific. And that trail he had just found. Desert dust continued to swirl, clinging to the faces and clothes of the expedition members. The surrounding expanse of endless sand seemed to hide thousands of secrets from the past. Since the suspicious stone structure had been discovered, the research tents had been moved closer to the site, and the atmosphere among them had become tense and enthusiastic. Professor Hiroshi Tanaka, as usual, was busy recording the results of land measurements and reviewing satellite photos of the excavation site. But his thoughts were not solely on archaeology that day. He still remembered last night's conversation about a mysterious figure named Abu Lahab and the surah that mentioned his name directly in the Islamic holy book. That afternoon, the desert air was hotter than usual. Yusuf, the local translator who also doubles as a guide, sat in the tent with Hiroshi. He was cleaning electronic equipment when he saw the professor staring out blankly. "Are you still thinking about that man who was cursed?" Yusuf asked with a small smile. Hiroshi turned his head slowly. "Yes, I can't forget the quote you read last night. The surah is too specific. The person's name is called directly. That is rare in ancient texts. Usually everything is allegorical." Yusuf nodded. "In the Quran, not many people's names are mentioned directly, only a few, and Abu Lahab is one of them. Can you read it again?" Calmly and slowly. I want to note Hiroshi's request this time with deeper interest. Yusuf nodded, then took a small mushaf from his leather bag. He opened the desired page, took a deep breath, then read, "Perish Abu Lahab's 2 hands, and indeed he will perish. It is of no use to him his possessions and what he works for. One day he would enter the roaring fire, and his wife, the firewood carrier, would be wearing a coconut fiber rope around her neck." Yusuf's voice was calm and full of emotion. Each word seemed to echo in the silent tent. Hiroshi listened without interrupting and then quickly jotted down notes in his field notes. As soon as Yusuf finished, he lifted his head. "This sounds like a very personal curse," Hiroshi said quietly. This short surah was like a direct pronouncement of judgment against one person. It even mentioned his wife, indeed Saud Yusuf. Abu Lahab not only opposed the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, he openly insulted, hurt, and humiliated him. He was a symbol of hostility to the truth that came from God. Therefore, Allah revealed this particular surah, making his fate eternal in history. Hiroshim Khan's eyes were misguided. He was not a religious man. Throughout his life, he viewed the holy books as mere cultural heritage reflecting the mindset of an ancient time. However, there was something odd here. These verses felt too directed to be fiction. If this man truly lived and died like a human being, why, in general, have stories about him survived in this way? And why was his final resting place found in a remote, almost untouched area? What was the fate of his body according to Islamic history? Hiroshi asked, reopening the discussion. According to some accounts, Abu Lahab died in a terrible condition. He had a deadly skin disease. His body rotted and gave off a foul odor. Even his family refused to take care of his body until finally buried by being thrown into a pit and covered with stones, Yusuf explained. So, if we really found the body, there should be such indications, Hiroshi murmured, his eyes sharpening again. He stood and picked up the digital tablet from the table. He reopened the excavation site map and ground radar images. There was still no certainty whether the structure beneath was truly a tomb, let alone Abu Lahab's. But the combination of ancient manuscript clues, the condition of the structure, and the geographical correspondence with historical accounts slowly pieced together the pieces into a startling possibility. Hiroshi began to realize that this discovery wasn't simply about stones or bones. It was about a narrative that had lived for thousands of years, about how a text could predict something that could be scientifically proven. He remembered all too well the arguments of philosophers and scientists against religion. He had been by their side, but now as he stood in the silent desert, reading an ancient surah about someone whose grave he might have been digging, his faith began to crack. "Yusuf," he said, "suddenly you believe in all this because of faith. I came with logic. But what if the two actually meet in the same place?" Yusuf smiled and said quietly, "Many find God through logic, but only the humble are willing to admit it." Those words echoed in Hiroshi's mind long after Yusuf had left the tent. Outside, the sun was slowly setting, illuminating the desert with a golden light. And behind that light, beneath the undisclosed sands, perhaps lurked not only the grave of a truth hater, but also the doorway for a sincere seeker to discover the truth he had so far ignored. The Hijaz desert still held its secrets proudly. The wind blew softly, but enough to send fine grains of sand floating like a golden mist in the morning sun. The expedition team's tent swayed gently in the gentle breeze. Meanwhile, the heavy equipment stood still, as if awaiting further instructions. In the midst of the mist, Professor Hiroshi Tanaka stood frozen. His eyes were fixed on the ground radar monitor displaying images from beneath the desert surface. The image was unmistakable. A symmetrical shape, about 2 meters deep, extended into a rectangular cavity too neat to be a natural phenomenon. The structure was surrounded by flat stones arranged like a frame, some kind of burial vault or perhaps an ancient burial chamber. "This isn't a cave, and it's definitely not a natural rock," Hiroshi said to his assistant in Japanese. Then he turned to Yusuf. "We must dig as quickly as possible, but carefully. We must not damage the structure." Work began as soon as the sun touched the horizon. Local workers and Japanese team members took turns carefully shoveling layers of sand, while others monitored changes in soil temperature and moisture. Each movement was slow, almost ritualistic, and no one spoke too loudly. Since the discovery of the strange inscription a few days earlier, the atmosphere at the site had been heavy. It was as if someone were watching from behind the still desert sky. After 3 hours of digging, the top of the structure began to emerge. A large stone slab sealed the space beneath, flanked by 2 short, time-worn pillars. The stone surface bore scratches like ancient Arabic script, but much of it had worn away. Although some were difficult to read, one faint phrase made Hiroshi's blood boil. He was gripped by rage. When the capstone was lifted using mechanical tools, a sharp, piercing aroma immediately emanated from it. It was a foul odor that wasn't just a corpse, but a combination of rotting flesh and damp, long-contained soil. Some workers covered their noses and backed away. Some even refused to approach again. The space beneath the stone. It wasn't very large. The walls were made of dry stones neatly stacked together. There were no decorations, no emblems or symbols of honor like those found in ancient noble tombs. In the center of the room lay a discolored corpse. Its skin was blackened like charcoal. But what stunned everyone was the condition of its body. It hadn't decayed normally. It looked as if it were being burned from within. Part of its face had melted to one side, but its frozen eyes seemed to still stare upward, with a lingering fear. Hiroshi couldn't look away. He had seen many mummies and skeletons in his career, but never anything like this. The body was intact, yet unnaturally disfigured. It was as if time hadn't devoured it, but something crueler, more wrathful. "This doesn't make sense," Hiroshi muttered softly. He knelt down to examine it more closely. At the side of the body lay a piece of coarse cloth, almost blending with the burned skin. And strangely, around the body's neck, there was still a piece of old coconut fiber-like rope, just as mentioned in the Surah Abu Lahab. Yusuf stood stiffly behind him. The coconut fiber rope was the neck of Abu Lahab's wife. Hiroshi turned quickly. "Do you really think this is him?" Yusuf didn't answer, but the expression on his face was enough to explain the growing conviction, even if it was tinged with fear. He wasn't a scientist, but what he saw that day wasn't something that could be explained by science alone. Something deeper and more obscure was lurking behind this event. As Hiroshi tried to take small samples of cloth and bone for carbon analysis, he felt a chill touch his skin. It wasn't a gust of wind, not a change in the weather, but a kind of pressure that made the back of his neck stiffen. He turned quickly toward the tomb door, but there was no one there. But his chest felt tight, as if it refused to be touched. That night, Hiroshi sat alone outside his tent. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the charred face of the corpse appeared staring back at him, as if asking why he had been brought back from his sleep. Hiroshi was not a wobbly young man, but that day he felt the line between fact and belief begin to blur. And perhaps for the first time in his life, he feared something he couldn't measure with instruments. Leaning back in his folding chair, he stared up at the star-studded Hijaz sky. Then he said slowly, half to himself, half to something that might be listening, "If this really is him, why is he still intact under the sand for thousands of years?" There was no answer that night. Only the whisper of the wind sweeping across the desert brought with it shadows long buried by time. But Hiroshi knew that whatever he had discovered that day, his life would never be the same again. The field laboratory was set up in one of the main tents, surrounded by transparent plastic screens that swayed in the desert breeze. Scientific equipment from Japan was installed with high-precision digital microscopes, spectrometers, and tissue structure scanners. In the center of the room, on a cold stainless steel table, lay a piece of bone from a body found in a mysterious grave. The bone was blackened not by ordinary fire, but by an internal oxidation process. The forensic team brought in from Tokyo worked in silence, their faces filled with unusual tension. Professor Hiroshi Tanaka stood beside them, recording the results of the analysis that continued to appear on the tablet screen. The soft clink of laboratory equipment combined with the rustling of the wind outside to form a symphony that it felt suffocating. He felt the deeper he delved into this mystery. The line between science and the undefinable grew increasingly blurred. "Look at this," said Miyako, the pathologist who had arrived the day before. She pointed to a scan of the bone tissue. "There's microscopic damage to the interior. It looks like the tissue is burning from the deepest layers, not from the outside. But strangely, there are no traces of carbon from an external fire." Hiroshi frowned. So it wasn't caused by high temperatures from outside the body, no. It was like the body was boiling from the inside, but not completely burned. The surface tissue was intact, though blackened. This wasn't a common chemical reaction. It didn't align with decomposition, nor did it align with mummification. He glanced at another screen displaying the radiocarbon dating results. The bone was dated to approximately 1400 years ago, right around the time of the early Islamic era. Even more accurately, it was the time when Abu Lahab lived and died. Hiroshi swallowed hard. He remembered the description Yusuf had recited from Surah Abu Lahab. One day he would enter a raging fire. At the time, he had considered it a metaphor for spiritual punishment. But now before him lay the body of someone whose remains proved that the punishment was no mere fairy tale. The fire was real, and this body bore it as proof. He rose from his seat and stepped to the other side of the tent, trying to escape the pressure that was weighing on his mind. Outside, the sky was turning orange, signaling the approach of dusk. The Hijaz desert seemed serene, as if harboring a great secret that had just been revealed. But that serenity now felt intimidating. like a sharp eye watching from the horizon. A few hours later, the results of tests on the fragments of cloth around the body arrived. The cloth contained remnants of old date palm fibers, similar to the description of the coconut fiber rope mentioned in the surah. And even more horrifying, there were abrasions in a circle around the skull's neck. This confirmed the suspicion that the person had indeed died from strangulation with a rough rope. Hiroshi was speechless. Each piece of data added another stone to the foundation that pointed to a single truth. This was no coincidence. This was proof beyond the reach of scientific logic. In the dark night, Hiroshi sat alone outside his tent, staring up at the starry sky. In his hands were the forensic records he had not yet handed over to his team. He knew that if this report were published, academic circles would be in uproar. One side would scorn him for being too close to myth. The other would accuse him of spreading religious propaganda. But he didn't care. What he saw, what he felt, and what he touched was too real to deny. He had never believed in religion. For him, faith was a realm beyond the reach of a microscope. But now there was something greater than the knowledge he had held so dear. Something that forced him to bow down and acknowledge human limitations. Hiroshi's thoughts drifted to the sentence that had been ringing in his ears since he heard the surah. The body they found was not surrounded by gold or symbols of greatness. It was simply imprisoned in a narrow, cold room, rotting under a curse that seemed to burn on. He wondered how many people who thought themselves immune to the consequences of their actions ended up like this, forgotten in the world, but immortalized in a punishment preserved by time. The night grew darker, but Hiroshi's mind grew brighter. He knew this was only the beginning. If one chapter could be proven through traces of bodies and scientific analysis, what about the others? Does everything that has been considered a fairy tale have a real historical foundation? The night wind gently blew the edge of the notebook in his hand. Hiroshi stared at the shining stars silently. Silently, he said to himself, to the God he had perhaps ignored, and to the truth that was beginning to creep into his heart. Maybe all this time I was not looking for proof, but the signs and signs I have now uncovered from his own grave. The days after the discovery felt like entering an unfamiliar time tunnel for Professor Hiroshi Tanaka. By day, he was still the scientist he always was, examining data, compiling reports, discussing with the team, and evaluating the analysis. But at night, when the desert grew silent and the sky seemed to close in, his mind began to tear between two worlds. The world of science he had been immersed in all his life, and the world of revelation that was slowly disturbing his deepest beliefs. Hiroshi sat on a folding chair outside the tent with a cup of warm tea, growing cold in the desert wind. On his lap lay a translated copy of the Quran that Yusuf had given him a few days earlier. The book seemed simple, but every time he read it, he felt an inexplicable inner tension. It was as if the words on the pages spoke directly to him, forcing him to stop searching for evidence and begin listening with his heart. He had read Surah Abu Lahab over and over again. The more he read it, the more the anxiety in his chest grew. The verses were too precise, too sharp, and too true to the reality he had found in the tomb. Even the term flaming fire no longer sounded metaphorical, but described the condition of the body with an accuracy inexplicable by science. Science taught me about cause and effect, about the measurable laws of physics and chemistry, he murmured softly. But what I saw seemed to transcend all those laws. He began to leaf through the Quran, discovering verses about the creation of man, the heavens and the earth, mountains, and even about the fetus in the womb. Some verses left him speechless. He wasn't a biologist, but as a scientist, he recognized patterns and precision. And this time, there were many that almost amazed him, though he was reluctant to admit it openly. That morning, Hiroshi approached Yusuf and asked him to introduce him to a Muslim scholar who could explain the Quran's interpretation in more depth. Yusuf, who had noticed a subtle change in Hiroshi's demeanor, nodded without question. Within 2 days, they arranged a meeting with Dr. Ammar, an expert in Islamic exegesis and theology professor from Medina. Their meeting was simple. Under the shade of a large tent, they sat cross-legged on a rug, enjoying dates and Arabic coffee. Dr. Ammar was a middle-aged man with a calm face and deep eyes. He listened attentively as Hiroshi recounted his findings, from the forensic findings to his own uncanny feelings about the body. "I want to know," Hiroshi finally said, "how could a book revealed 14 centuries ago describe such a thing so accurately? Is there a logical explanation behind all this?" Dr. Ammar smiled faintly. "Many come with questions like that, Professor, and most of them find that human logic has its limits. The Quran is not a science book, but it does not contradict science. It is revelation. And revelation is not to be debated like theories, but to be contemplated. But as a scientist, I must question, seek explanations, test possibilities," Hiroshi replied. "That is your path, and it is not wrong, Doctor," Ammar replied calmly. "But when you reach a point where all your theories fail to explain the truth before your eyes, perhaps that is when you are being invited to see differently, not through the lens of a microscope, but through the lens of your heart." Those words echoed in Hiroshi's head late into the night. He stared at the analysis results, temperature graphs, bone tissue maps, and chemistry reports. Everything was so precise, but it felt empty. He remembered how for years he had avoided religion because he considered it unscientific. But now it was science that had brought him to the threshold of a deeper understanding of revelation. In his solitude that night, Hiroshi opened the mushaf lying on a small table. He read the translation of Surah al-Baqarah. This is a book in which there is no doubt. Guidance for those who are pious. The words stuck deep. He began to ask questions not to argue, but to understand. Perhaps he had not been wrong with his knowledge all this time, but he had simply not encountered something greater than all that. And now, after seeing how one small surah could shake his world of logic, he knew the clash was not destruction, but an invitation to bridge the world, science and revelation, a bridge that might lead him to the true truth, which he had been unconsciously pursuing. The desert sky turned orange as the sun began to lower below the western horizon. Copper light refracted above the neatly erected tents. Meanwhile, fine dust fluttered in the afternoon breeze. In one corner of the expedition camp, Professor Hiroshi Tanaka sat cross-legged on a rug facing a young man in a clean white robe. His name was Sheikh Khalid, a graduate of the Islamic University of Medina, known not only for his breadth of knowledge, but also for the gentleness and clarity of his delivery. Hiroshi observed the man's serene face shining with deep yet kind eyes. There was not a hint of patronizing tone in his voice. Their conversation had lasted almost an hour, but it felt like only a few minutes. It wasn't because the time passed quickly, but because each word felt weighty, filling empty spaces his mind had previously overlooked. "I didn't come to convince you, Professor," Khalid said with a smile. "I simply wanted to offer you a window. You can open it any time or not at all. That's your choice." Hiroshi responded with a small nod. I appreciated that. Most people I'd met were usually eager to prove themselves right, because most people are too afraid to let the truth be discovered for themselves, Kaladringan replied. But truth doesn't belong to anyone. It's only willing to reveal itself to those who seek it. Hiroshi drew a long breath. "I've read translations of several chapters of the Quran. I was surprised. Most of the content is rational, even logical, but at the same time it touches on something I can't explain. It's as if I'm talking to the sky, not reading a book." Kali smiled broadly. "Then you're at the right gate. The Quran isn't just words, it's a conversation. Sometimes quiet, sometimes firm, sometimes embracing, sometimes sharp. But most importantly, it's alive. It doesn't ask us to believe blindly. On the contrary, it invites thought, reflection, and testing." Hiroshi nodded slowly. He remembered the Al-Ghaziyah chapter he'd just read that morning. So don't they observe the camel, how it was created, and the sky, how it was raised? For him, the verse was like an intellectual challenge, not a dogma. "I want to know more about Abu Lahab," Hiroshi finally said. "Why is he the only figure mentioned by name directly in the Quran? What is so great about him?" His influence was even given a special surah. Khalid took a slow breath. Abu Lahab was the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, but he became a major enemy of the Islamic preaching. His rejection was not only because of belief, but because of arrogance, self-esteem, and fear of losing social position. He didn't just refuse silently. He fights, criticizes, hurts. His wife also joined in the hatred. But why is the surah so specific? As if written with the belief that he would die in a bad way, Hiroshi asked with a frown. That is where the magic of the Quran lies, answered Khalid. Surah Al-Lahab was revealed many years before Abu Lahab died. If he wants to destroy the credibility of the Prophet Muhammad, it's easy. He quite pretended to convert to Islam, but he didn't. His hatred made him blind, and in the end he truly died in humiliation, according to the prophecy in those verses. Hiroshi was silent for a long time. His heart seemed to be shaking. He who has been chasing scientific evidence all his life is now faced with something that cannot be tested with tools, but feels real deep within himself. What do you mean? All of this was written by God. The Quran is not written by humans, Khalid replied softly. If you delve into its contents honestly, you will know. No human being is capable of writing something like this, not only because the language is beautiful or the content is vast, but because it penetrates time, heart, and mind. Sign leads us to ask how, but Wahyu answered, why? Hiroshi lowered his head. The words were soft yet profound, like the tinkling of a small bell in a long, quiet hallway. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting Khalid's voice and the gentle desert breeze flow past him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to be an expert to understand the truth. He simply needed to be human. Night fell slowly. The stars began to twinkle in the vast sky. In their silence, Hiroshi felt as if he were in dialogue with something higher, greater, more knowledgeable. He didn't need to be explained further that night, because what he needed wasn't an answer, but the courage to accept that some questions weren't meant to be answered, but rather contemplated. And in that silence, Hiroshi knew the conversation wasn't over, but he had opened the door. Now the sky waited for an answer. That night, a desert wind blew softly, carrying the scent of cool sand. Inside his small tent, Hiroshi Tanaka lay restless. His body was exhausted, but his mind continued to work. The conversations with Sheikh Khalid over the past few days had opened many new spaces within him, spaces that had been tightly closed by logic and skepticism. He tried to close his eyes, but faces from the past and fragments of verses from the Quran kept appearing in his mind. Yusuf's voice patiently explained the meaning of Surah Al-Lahab. Khalid's explanation of Abu Lahab's inner blindness and the condition of his body, still vivid in his mind, made sleep seem distant. And that night, exhausted from his thoughts, Hiroshi finally drifted off to sleep. But it wasn't just ordinary rest. That night he had a dream. He stood in the middle of a vast desert. The sky above him was a deep yet bright blue. It was as if dawn and dusk were blending into one. There was no sound, only the gentle whisper of the wind touching his face. Then from a distance, the figure of an Arab man in a white robe appeared. His face was radiant, his eyes calm yet sharp. His steps were steady, approaching. The man didn't speak, but the voice rang clearly in Hiroshi's head in Japanese. You search hard, but forget to listen quietly. Hiroshi was frozen, tongue-tied. He wanted to ask, want to know who that man was? But his body felt as if it were bound by a gentle, yet irresistible force. Revelation doesn't defy logic. It embraces logic and leads him to something higher. The man then pointed to the sky, and from the tip of his index finger emerged a light that curved like a sickle, gently cutting through the sky. The sky opened, and verses appeared floating like sheets of light. The previously unfamiliar Arabic letters were now clearly legible in Hiroshi's mind. Did humans expect to be left aimlessly? Did they not ponder their origin and end? The voice rang deep and thrilling. Hiroshi sobbed. For some reason, his chest felt tight. He didn't know where it came from. A kind of longing, a kind of fear, a kind of long-delayed return. Suddenly, the man leaned in, gently touching Hiroshi's chest and saying, wake up and see not just with your eyes, but with your heart. The light is waiting. Hiroshi woke up gasping for breath. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Despite the piercing desert night, he sat still on his folding bed. His eyes were wide open, staring at the empty tent wall. But his mind was still in the dream. There was no sound, no movement, only the pounding of his heart. He reached for the small mushaf lying beside his bed. With trembling hands, he opened it at random. The verse that appeared right in front of him was, "And did they not think about the kingdoms of heaven and earth and everything that Allah created?" Aleph 185. Hiroshi was speechless. He just looked down, his eyes hot. For the first time in his life, he felt something beyond understanding. Something that is not present through logic or argument. The dream is not just a dream. It's like a calling, a gentle but sure invitation. The next morning, when the sun had just risen behind the sand dunes, Hiroshi approached Yusuf with puffy eyes but a calm face. "I want to learn more about the Quran," he said quietly. "Not just as a text, not just as history, but as a path." Perhaps in response, Yusuf looked at him with sparkling eyes. But he didn't cheer, didn't speak at length. He just patted Hiroshi's scent gently and then invited him to sit together outside the tent. That day, the first lesson began not from a book of interpretation, not from an academic book, but from a heart that was beginning to open and from the sky that had spoken. In his dream, Hiroshi took careful notes, but no longer for a scientific report. This time he took notes for himself, for a journey that might not return. However, he was not afraid because in his dream last night, he felt someone guiding him, and that light now felt closer than ever. The afternoon desert breeze carried the distinctive scent of sand and angsana, which grew wild around a small oasis near an ancient village nearly erased from the map. Hiroshi sat under a date palm tree with Yusuf, waiting for someone who was said to hold a story passed down through generations about an ancient tomb they had recently discovered. The man was said to be the keeper of the story, a witness of the times whose age was hard to guess, with eyes that held a history deeper than scholarly books. From the west, an old man appeared, walking slowly, using a wooden cane. His white robes were faded but still clean. The wrinkles on his face were not just the result of age, but of time spent with the old stories passed down by word of mouth. His name was Abdul Karim, and according to the villagers, he was the last descendant of a line of guardians of the site that was now shaking the world of archaeology. Hiroshi stood and greeted him with a slight bow, while Yusuf introduced him in Arabic. After a simple greeting, Abdul Karim sat cross-legged on a rug laid out especially for him. His face was serene, his voice calm, yet composed. "I knew you would come," he said, looking at Hiroshi with eyes that seemed to penetrate time. "The tomb wasn't a secret to us, but it wasn't something to be opened just like that either." Hiroshi bowed politely. He knew this wasn't the time to argue or interrupt. The old man closed his eyes for a moment and then began to tell his story. "My great-grandfather always said there was one place in this barren desert that must not be disturbed. People called it Makbar Alain, the tomb of the cursed. No one dared approach. Even shepherds would detour if they got too close to that land." And Abdul Karim's voice trembled, but he continued speaking steadily. "For generations we've been taught that this place was the site of a man burned by God's curse. Not an ordinary fire, but his own. A fire that wouldn't be extinguished by time, and every few decades a strange light would appear at night from beneath the sand like a glowing ember." Hiroshi listened without blinking. He clearly remembered the condition of the body inside the tomb they found. The body, seemingly burned from within but not destroyed, seemed preserved in agony, eternal. Abdul Karim's explanation, although traditional, aligns with the scientific reality he witnessed. "Is there a name that has been passed down through generations?" Hiroshi asked, translating Yusuf. Abdul Karim nodded slowly. "We never mentioned his name directly, but from the oral histories we learned, the man was the uncle of a prophet. He was fiercely hostile to the dawah brought to this land. He insulted, obstructed, and contributed to the incitement of hatred. Finally, God punished him, and the prophet received a revelation that mentioned him directly." Hiroshi took a deep breath. All the clues, from archaeological finds to Quranic verses to local oral histories, pointed to a figure named Abu Lahab. "Has anyone ever tried to open that tomb before?" Hiroshi asked. "Have they?" Abdul Karim replied, his voice strained. 50 years ago, a group of miners came, hearing there were rare metals nearby. They dug without permission. Within 3 days, 2 people became seriously ill. One died, his body burned for no apparent reason. Since then, the site has been restored to its original state, and our village has vowed never to disturb it again. Hiroshi felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. All of this was too specific, too consistent, and too powerful to ignore. He looked at the old man with warming eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Abdul Karim," he said softly through Yusuf. "Your story is very precious. More than all the data we've collected so far." Abdul Karim smiled faintly. "Your science is extraordinary. But don't forget that some things can't be measured with tools, only with the heart. Sometimes the truth isn't something newly discovered, but something long waiting to be heard again." That afternoon, the sun set slowly behind the dunes, coloring the sky a golden orange. Hiroshi sat silently, letting Abdul Karim's words sink into his mind. He had come as a scientist, bringing measuring instruments, data, and theories. But now he was beginning to realize that some parts of the truth weren't recorded in the laboratory, but lived in memories, dreams, in the human heart. The morning light streamed in through the window of the simple laboratory, which had been transformed into Hiroshi's private study. Inside, stacks of journals, manuscripts, maps, and fragments of geological data filled almost every corner. But among them all, there was one object he always placed at the top: a Japanese Arabic language copy of the Quran, now covered in small notes in the margins. It had been more than 6 months since the expedition began. From a professor who relied heavily on rationality, he had now become a seeker thirsting not only for facts, but also for meaning. Hiroshi sat in front of his laptop, staring at a blank screen before his fingers began to dance across the keyboard. He began composing a scientific paper not merely as a report on the expedition, but as a personal testimony to the intellectual and spiritual upheaval he had experienced. The paper began as usual: the research methods, the location of the equipment used, geophysical data, the results of underground radar scans, and forensic analysis of the bodies inside the tomb. Everything was neatly arranged, complete with references from international journals and strict scientific standards. But when he reached the discussion section, his tone began to change. He wrote that based on laboratory results, no technology or natural conditions could explain why the bodies in the tomb were burned from within yet remained intact. There were no traces of chemicals, no radiation exposure, and no normal biological decomposition processes. He called it a biological thermal anomaly that had no equivalent in modern scientific literature. But the conclusion of the paper was an unexpected surprise for anyone who read it. He wrote that after long reflection, cross-cultural discussions, and study of Islamic scriptures, he no longer saw revelation as the opposite of science, but rather as a light that illuminates the gaps in human logic. "As a scientist," Hiroshi wrote, "I am accustomed to seeing things that can be measured, calculated, and replicated. But what I witnessed in that desert and what I felt when I read Surah Abu Lahab was not simply empirical truth. It was a message from another dimension that did not deny logic but transcended it." His hand paused for a moment, typing on the screen. The cursor blinked slowly as if waiting for the most important sentence of his life. He stared out the window. The desert wind still blew calmly, carrying dust and hope simultaneously. Then he typed the final sentence with determination. "I hereby declare that I believe that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah and that there is no God but Allah." He paused, took a deep breath, and silently recited the Shahada. Not aloud, not in the company of the crowd, but in the purest silence. His heart was at peace. For the first time in his life, Hiroshi felt that he truly understood the meaning of knowledge. Not just to know, but to submit to the all-knowing. A few days later, he asked Yusuf to accompany him to an old mosque on the outskirts of Medina. The afternoon sky was bathed in soft light, and the air felt warm, like a universal embrace. Before an imam and several witnesses he didn't know, Hiroshi stood in simple attire. No cameras, no publicity, just sincere intentions and determined steps. With a steady voice, he recited the 2 sentences of the Shahada in Arabic, though his pronunciation was still awkward. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. It was as if the world itself was trembling with his decision. The imam smiled. Yusuf shed tears and Hiroshi lowered his head, crying silently. They weren't tears of sadness, but of release, like dew falling from a leaf in the morning, clear and meaningful. When he emerged from the mosque, the sun was already setting. The orange light framed his face, which now looked more peaceful. He was no longer just Professor Hiroshi Tanaka, a scientist from Japan. He had become part of a much larger story, a story of light that can penetrate logic and a heart that can see even when the eyes cannot comprehend. And on his new steps, Hiroshi knew his true quest had only just begun. A light snow blanketed the roofs of Kyoto's old houses as Hiroshi Tanaka stepped out of his home. The winter air was bone-chilling, but his face radiated a warmth indescribable by temperature. He wore a long coat and a shoulder bag filled with books. Among them were a copy of the Quran, commentary notes, and copies of his scientific papers translated into Japanese. It had been a year since Hiroshi pronounced the Shahada in Arabia. Since then, his life has changed completely. He is no longer known simply as a geology professor at the University of Tokyo, but also as a new Muslim intellectual with a unique approach combining science and spirituality in a logical, calm, and elegant manner. In Japan, he started with a small circle, attending small seminars on campus, Muslim community gatherings, and short videos explaining science in the Quran that he posted on his personal channel. Unexpectedly, the channel grew rapidly. Thousands of people from various backgrounds began following his explanations. Not because he explicitly invited them, but because he responded with logic and data that could not be ignored. The story of his discovery of a mysterious tomb in the Hijaz, a body burned from within but not destroyed, and his dream of a man in a white robe who called to him in the language of the heart. All of this became the subject of heated discussion on various platforms. He neither exaggerated the story nor commercialized it. In fact, his scientific approach and honesty fueled people's interest. In Japan, religion is often considered a private matter that shouldn't be discussed too openly. But Hiroshi found a space amidst that. He didn't speak of faith as dogma, but as a fact that could be studied. When he explained that the Surah Abu Lahab, revealed over 1,000 years ago, described the condition of Abu Lahab's body, which was burned from within but not destroyed, the rational Japanese public began to listen. If it wasn't from God, how could Muhammad have written it so specifically and consistently? That was Hiroshi's most shared sentence. When the virality could no longer be contained, invitations poured in from all corners of the world. But what left him most speechless was an official letter from the Islamic University of Medina. In Arabic and English, they invited him to attend as a guest of honor to deliver a lecture at the annual scientific forum attended by Muslim scholars, intellectuals, and scientists from various countries. He read the letter in his office, his eyes filled with tears as he traveled from Japan to Medina, his murmuring as if marking a true journey home. Not to the place of his birth, but to the place where he had been meaningfully reborn. The day arrived. He stepped into Medina airport, dressed in pristine white, blending in with the warm and peaceful atmosphere of the Prophet's city. In the large hall where the event was taking place, attendees had already filled the neatly arranged chairs. Faces from various nations, robed, turbaned, and dressed in suits, all looked toward the main stage where Hiroshi stood. He opened his lecture in Arabic, still somewhat stiff but clear. He described his journey not as one who had been conquered by Islam, but as someone who had finally discovered that science was not a tool to reject religion, but rather a ladder to achieve it. "I did not convert to Islam by miracle," he said loudly. "I converted to Islam because the truth is too consistent to be ignored and too profound to be explained with ordinary logic." The hall fell silent. Then the applause echoed not just for his speech, but for the long journey of searching he had traveled alone with complete honesty. One of the great scholars in attendance even rose from his seat and approached Hiroshi after the lecture. Afterward, he hugged Hiroshi and whispered, "You are not just a scientist. You are now a proof for people of reason." After the event, Hiroshi sat in the Prophet's mosque, gazing at the clear night sky of Medina. Amidst the rumbling of prayers and the soft chanting of dhikr, he smiled. From afar, he heard the call to prayer, and for the first time, he truly felt home. And so the journey ended. or perhaps it had just begun. From the snows of Kyoto to the dust of the Hijaz, from logic to faith, from the silence of the laboratory to the thunder of the Shahada, from Japan to Medina. And God knows best. I hope this story is helpful. I apologize for any shortcomings. Thomas Ranford, a professor of archaeology at the University of Oxford, looked out the window expectantly. For years, he had researched ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. But this time, his trip was different. He wasn't just here to dig up history. He was here to debunk a myth. The myth mentioned Abu Lahab, one of the most hated figures in Islamic history, directly cursed in the Quran. Thomas had read the quote many times before his departure. "Perish the hands of Abu Lahab and perish him." Surah Al-Lahab, verse 1. For Thomas, this was a fascinating puzzle. What could make a man so hated that his name would be immortalized in eternal damnation, and even stranger? Why was his tomb supposedly cursed by the locals? There were no official archaeological records, no exact coordinates, only stories told by the Bedouin tribe, who refused to touch the site. With scientific enthusiasm and typical Western skepticism, Thomas began his project. He compiled reports, old colonial records, and even folklore often dismissed as superstition. All pointed to one conclusion: the tomb existed, but had been forgotten by time or deliberately hidden. On his first night in Medina, he struck up a conversation with a local driver named Fidel. Thomas mentioned Abu Lahab lightly, but Fidel suddenly fell silent. His eyes narrowed. Then he said softly, "Don't talk about that, sir. Some things are better left buried." But Thomas smiled, undaunted. "It was precisely because it was buried that I came to dig." What he did not know that night was that it was the beginning of a journey that would not only shake his scientific convictions, but also awaken the deepest parts of his soul. That morning, Thomas sat in a small cafe near the Prophet's Mosque, leafing through his notes while sipping Arabic coffee, which was too strong for his European palate. Before him lay the photocopied pages of manuscripts, historical articles, and fragments of the Quran that he had been studying for months. Abu Lahab, his real name Abdul Usa Abdul Muttalib, was the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, but also a bitter enemy of the early Islamic mission. Abu Lahab's nickname means father of fire, not only because of his ruddy appearance, but also because of his fiery temper and his unrelenting hostility. In the West, Thomas was accustomed to separating religion and history, but in this case, he was shocked because a single chapter in the Quran seemed to explicitly name a person destined for destruction in hell, tormented by blazing fire. No other human being was ever named, immortalized in such a curse, and will one day be thrown into the blazing fire of Allah. Verse 3. For Muslims, this is a form of divine justice, but for Thomas, it is a historical conundrum. Who could be so important or so dangerous that they should be cursed directly in the scriptures? Why is there no attempt at forgiveness or a narrative of repentance? He notes 3 key points. First, Abu Lahab was a public figure and a member of the Prophet's own family. Second, he was not merely an opponent, but an active instigator who attacked the Prophet's message from within the Quraysh family structure. Third, the curse was revealed during his lifetime and never disproved, even though he had years to prove otherwise. Interesting, Thomas mused. If this were a man-made text, wouldn't it be risky to curse someone who was still alive and could repent and then disgrace the text? That was the beginning of his suspicions. The curse was either too bold or too certain. That night, he turned on his desk lamp and scribbled a new note. If I can find Abu Lahab's grave and the evidence of his end, perhaps I will discover a greater truth. He didn't know the words. It would be a promise that would lead him into darkness before finally finding the light. 2 days later, Thomas rented an old Jeep and was accompanied by Fad, a local driver who was still reluctant to talk about the tomb. They headed to an area outside the city limits of Medina, approaching the rocky plains where the Bedouin tribe used to graze and camp. According to old maps he had gathered from colonial archives and the notes of medieval Arab travelers, Abu Lahab's tomb was believed to be somewhere near the former village of Bani Hashim. However, no exact coordinates were ever mentioned. All clues pointed to one thing: the tomb was shunned. Arriving at a small village on the edge of the desert, Thomas tried to speak with an old man sitting in front of a carpentry workshop. The man wore a white turban and stared intently. When Thomas mentioned Abu Lahab, the old man said gently, "You're a foreigner, and you want to know something even we don't know." He avoided the idea since childhood. "Don't continue your search." Thomas smiled politely. "I just want to learn history. I'm a researcher." The old man shook his head. "That's not history. That's a warning. Even dogs won't go near that place." Fad, who was standing behind Thomas, bowed his head silently. He didn't join in the persuasion. There was a palpable tension among the villagers. Even the children who had been playing moved away when Thomas spoke, as if the name alone could bring bad luck. But Thomas remained determined. He tried again the next day, this time speaking to a young man named Harriet who seemed more open. Harriet said, "There's a place called the Tomb of Al-Munin, the Tomb of the Damned, but no one dares go there alone." When Thomas asked where it was, Harriet just shrugged. "I can show you the general direction," he said, "but don't expect anyone to lead you there." At night, Fidel finally spoke. "Mr. Thomas," he said, lighting a cigarette, "I'm coming with you because it's a job, but if you keep going there, I won't go in. Many people have become ill or possessed after entering that area. This isn't like an ordinary tomb." Thomas looked up at the starry night sky. To him, all of this was just superstition. But he also realized that no other place frightened him like this. And the more forbidden it was, the stronger his determination to enter. He wrote in his journal that night, "Tomorrow I will enter the forbidden area myself if necessary, and if there really is a mystery there, I will find it." He didn't know that this quest would be the beginning of a rift between reason and faith within him. That night, Thomas decided to go alone. Fidel refused to accompany him, and Harrow gave him only rough directions to the Al-Malunin tomb, a place said to be visited by lost souls. Few people knew for sure where it was, and even fewer were willing to talk about it. But for Thomas, this was the only test to uncover a truth that had been buried for too long. From the quiet village, he drove his jeep into the desert. Only the sound of the engine and the rustling of the desert wind accompanied his steps. The distance was quite far, but he felt closer. The further away from civilization he got, the more he felt like he was placed in a different world, beyond time and space. Once he arrived, he would see something beyond comprehension. Near midnight, he arrived at what he thought was his destination. There were no clear signs or landmarks, just a mound of earth that looked like a burial ground. He looked around, feeling a strange tension. The atmosphere felt incredibly hidden, as if shrouded in darkness, preventing his eyes from seeing what was truly before him. Thomas turned off the engine and stepped out. The desert night air blew strongly, carrying the scent of earth and dust. His footsteps echoed in the silent night. He took a flashlight from his bag and began exploring the area. The ground was hard, as if something was holding him back. As he shone the light on one spot, he noticed something strange. There was a large stone shaped like a closed door. Determined, he approached the stone, touched it, and felt an unnatural temperature. It was too cold, almost freezing. Despite the scorching heat of the desert midday, a strange feeling crept over him. The stone was unusual, unlike any he had found in previous excavations. He shone his flashlight further and discovered what looked like an engraving, covered by a thick layer of sand. The engraving was barely visible, but it seemed to form a strange script. Thomas quickly brushed the sand aside and, with a pounding heart, finally managed to read a bit of the writing. This was the end for those who opposed the truth. His feelings grew uneasy. He stood before the stone, contemplating. The words weren't just a warning, they seemed like confirmation of something greater. Was this really Abu Lahab's tomb? Or perhaps it was just a legend that transcended historical truth. But before he could go any further, he heard faint voices, almost whispers of something he couldn't explain. The voices came from underground, from behind a large boulder blocking the path. He leaned forward and fear began to creep over him. The voices stopped. At that moment, the flashlight in his hand flickered and then went out completely. In the pitch darkness, he felt as if something was watching him. There was something there that wanted him to leave, and he immediately felt a heat, as if a fire were burning inside him. Panicked, he immediately turned and ran to his jeep. As he drove back to the village, his body trembled. He felt as if something was following him, waiting for him to return. In his head, only one question kept echoing. What have I just found? The next morning, Thomas woke with a heavy head and a heart full of confusion. He couldn't forget the events of the previous night, the voice that came from nowhere, and the strange feeling that still haunted him. What he had found in the tomb could not be explained by scientific logic alone. What did it all mean? Why did he feel so attached to the place? That morning, he decided to visit a scholar living in Medina, who was known to have profound knowledge of Islamic history and Quranic interpretation. The scholar's name was Sheikh Ahmed, a prominent figure who had long dedicated himself to teaching and researching the meanings contained in the Quranic revelations. In that simple but magnificent mosque, Thomas met Sheikh Ahmed. After a brief discussion about the background of his research, Thomas hesitantly shared his experience, telling the story of his discovery at Abu Lahab's tomb and the uneasy feeling it had caused him. Sheikh Ahmed listened attentively and then raised the Quran in front of him. In a soft voice, he began to explain. Abu Lahab, though an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, was an opponent of the truth. He not only rejected the revelations brought by the Prophet, but he also mocked and persecuted the Muslims who had recently embraced the religion. Allah, in his greatness, sent down the revelation to indicate that his end would be damnation. Thomas was stunned. He had studied Abu Lahab's history, but this explanation took on a new, deeper dimension. Sheikh Ahmed continued, "The Quran is a perfect holy book. It does not merely recount history or stories of the past, but also contains wisdom that can be understood by all ages. The verse from Allah that curses Abu Lahab and his wife is not only a warning to them, but also a warning to anyone who opposes the truth brought by Allah." However, Sheikh Ahmed continued, "What's more important is understanding how the curse was enforced. This was not simply a punishment, but a manifestation of God's perfect justice. Abu Lahab was given a chance to live, but he chose to rebel and spread hatred. And God, in his wisdom, has determined an undeniable end for all who deny his truth." Thomas was stunned. He began to realize that what he had found in the tomb, a large stone with mysterious inscriptions, was no mere coincidence. Something greater was at work in his search. So Thomas asked in a whisper, "What I saw there, could it actually have something to do with this curse?" Sheikh Ahmad looked at him with wise eyes. "Perhaps, Mr. Renford, nature has a way of revealing signs to those who are willing to look with an open heart. Perhaps the tomb is a greater warning, not only to us, but to every soul seeking the truth." Thomas paused for a moment, pondering what he had just heard. Something burned within him, something far deeper than mere scientific curiosity. He felt as if a door had opened, and beyond it lay a broader understanding of life, death, and justice. As he stood to leave the mosque, Sheikh Ahmed said, "Sometimes to find the truth, we must let go of our egos and old beliefs. The path you have chosen, Mr. Renford, will take you further than mere scientific discovery. It will take you on a spiritual journey that cannot be measured by mere reason." Thomas looked at Sheikh Ahmed and thanked him for those meaningful words. He felt increasingly convinced that his quest was not simply to find a tomb, but to find himself in connection with a greater truth. Outside the mosque, Thomas gazed at the blue sky of Medina. A sense of peace began to flow through him. No longer a mere researcher searching for historical evidence, he now felt like a seeker of truth called to look beyond the visible. After his encounter with Sheikh Ahmad, Thomas felt torn between the scientific world he knew and the spiritual world he was just beginning to experience. For years, he had studied history, studied artifacts, and tested theories. All of this was based on the principles of objectivity and measurable evidence. But his encounter with Sheikh Ahmad opened a new dimension that tested his beliefs. The following days felt like living in two different worlds. On the one hand, he continued his exploration of the tomb site, photographing every object and noting every detail that might provide scientific evidence. But on the other, a growing feeling in his heart could not be ignored. A feeling that there was a truth deeper than what was visible on the surface. He returned to Abu Lahab's tomb, this time with a heavier feeling. The large stone he had encountered earlier was still in place, but now he could no longer see it as a mere inanimate object. The stone felt like a silent witness to something greater, something he could not comprehend with his common sense alone. At the same time, Thomas's thoughts began to conflict. As a scientist, he believed in science, something that could be proven and based on facts and data. But the more he reflected on his encounter with Sheikh Ahmad, the more he felt that what he had experienced was more than just a scientific discovery. There was something deeper, more spiritual connected to his quest. He asked himself, am I seeking scientific truth or a greater truth beyond the reach of evidence? Will this discovery bring me closer to understanding or further from what I believe to be true? This confusion grew more and more intense as he tried to revert to the logical assumption that everything natural could be explained. But a voice within him grew louder, reminding him that science was not the only path to truth. In the stillness of the night, Thomas sat outside his room, the warm, dry desert wind blowing against his face. He gazed up at the starry sky and felt for the first time how small he was in the face of the vastness of the universe. He remembered a verse recited by Sheikh Ahmad, "For every people there is a way that leads them to truth." For him, what mattered was not simply finding Abu Lahab's tomb, but a deeper search, a search for the meaning of life and the truth behind all he had learned. Finally, he made a decision. The next day, he would meet again with Sheikh Ahmad to continue their conversation. But this time, he wanted to ask more questions, not just about history or interpretation, but about how one could attain a deeper spiritual understanding of how knowledge and faith could coexist. At that moment, Thomas knew one thing for certain. This journey had not only transformed his view of history, but also of himself. He now stood at a crossroads between what he had learned so far and what he was just beginning to discover, something far greater than mere knowledge. That morning, after several nights of struggling with inner restlessness, Thomas felt his search must continue at a deeper level. Not just about scientific truths that could be probed with ordinary methods, but a spiritual quest that was beginning to call to him. His desire was to gain further insight into the meaning of what he had found at Abu Lahab's grave. He took it back to Sheikh Ahmed Assad. The feeling that dominated him grew stronger. He was interested not only in the interpretation of the Quranic verses concerning Abu Lahab's curse, but also in how the Islamic view of the spiritual life could answer his thirst for something greater than mere worldly knowledge. In the peaceful mosque of Medina, Sheikh Ahmad was waiting for him. He greeted Thomas with a wise smile, and after exchanging greetings, they sat in a corner of the room, filled with books piled like a mountain. That's when Thomas began the conversation he'd been wanting to have for a long time. Sheikh Ahmad looked at Thomas and spoke in a deeper voice. Over the past few days, I've begun to feel that my quest is no longer just about history or scientific discoveries. There's something bigger here, something I can't explain with logic alone. What I encountered at Abu Lahab's tomb, the feelings I experienced there, all led me to a bigger question. What is the meaning of life and death in Islam? Sheikh Ahmad listened intently. Then he looked at Thomas with a meaningful look. One thing you need to understand, Mr. Ranford, is that every true quest is a quest to understand our relationship with God, with His creation, and with ourselves. Islam teaches that knowledge and faith are not two separate things, but two sides of the same coin. Knowledge is how we understand creation, while faith is how we understand the Creator. Thomas pondered, trying to grasp the meaning of those words. Between knowledge based on scientific evidence and faith that is often unprovable, Sheikh Ahmad smiled gently. Of course, there is a difference between knowledge gained through the senses and reason and knowledge that comes through spiritual revelation and intuition, but that difference does not mean the two cannot coexist. Science reveals the laws of nature created by God, while faith gives us guidance to understand the purpose and meaning of our lives in a broader context. When we look at the world with both eyes, knowledge and faith, we see the world more fully. Thomas fell silent, absorbing every word that had just been spoken. He began to feel something inexplicable. It was as if something was beginning to coalesce within him, something that transcended both scientific findings and the beliefs he often considered dogma. "I want to know more, Sheikh." Thomas said finally, about how Islam views death in the afterlife. If Abu Lahab's tomb really exists, and I believe it to be a cursed place, does this mean there is a real afterlife? Sheikh Ahmad took a deep breath before answering. Islam teaches that the afterlife is one of the most important aspects of faith. Death is not the end, but rather a transition. Every good deed we do in this world will be rewarded accordingly in the afterlife. Abu Lahab, though he was part of the Prophet's family, chose to deny the truth brought by Muhammad. It was a choice with serious consequences. The Surah Al-Quran not only condemned him, but also showed us that no soul is free from accountability before God. Thomas felt as if he had opened the door to a deeper understanding. Previously, he had always viewed death as the end of everything, a biological phenomenon that could be explained scientifically. But the more he delved into this teaching, the more he felt that there was another dimension he had overlooked, a spiritual dimension that connects each individual to God in the afterlife. So it is Abu Lahab's tomb that I have found, Thomas said slowly. Does that mean I have seen one of the signs of a greater truth? Is this truly a message of God's justice? Sheikh Ahmed nodded. The grave was not just a place, it was a symbol, a reminder that every soul will be rewarded according to its deeds. The curse directed at Abu Lahab was not only directed at him, but also at anyone who opposes the truth brought by the Prophet Muhammad, and also to anyone who, it was only God who had closed his heart to God's revelation. Thomas felt a burning within him, not only because of the archaeological discoveries he had encountered, but also because of a deeper understanding of life, justice, and the afterlife. He began to realize that his quest would not only uncover the past, but also reveal a greater truth. Truth is inseparable from strong faith. After that meaningful conversation, Thomas left the mosque with a different feeling. His heart felt lighter, his mind more open, and he felt that this journey was not over. Perhaps it had just begun. That night, after his profound meeting with Sheikh Ahmad, Thomas sat alone in his guest room in Medina. The cool desert air coming through the window brought a calm he had never felt before. He reflected deeply, trying to piece together the pieces of his quest, which now felt more like an inner journey than a scientific mission. The past few days had felt like an opening, not just to historical or scientific discoveries, but also to how he saw the world and, more importantly, how he saw himself. He realized that his quest was not just about understanding artifacts or uncovering past history, but about discovering a deeper meaning that involved faith, heart, and soul. Soul. In the silence of the night, Thomas thought about his meeting with Sheikh Ahmad and all he had learned. The cleric's words about science and faith living side by side began to sink into him. Science is how we understand creation, Sheikh Ahmad said. Faith is the way we understand the Creator. Thomas began to feel the depth of meaning in that sentence. Knowledge and faith were not two opposing things, but two paths that could lead to the same truth. As he pondered, he recalled his first night at Abu Lahab's tomb, the mysterious voice that seemed to come from underground, the large stone that felt more than just an archaeological object in the inscription he had found. Now everything felt like part of a larger message. There was something more than science could explain. There was something beyond the reach of reason and the five senses, something that connected the physical and spiritual worlds. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, trying to free himself from the confusion that had plagued him. Inside, a calm began to form, a glimmer of enlightenment. It was as if he finally understood what he was searching for. He opened his eyes and looked back out the window. In the dark night sky, the stars twinkled like silent witnesses to the long journey he had taken. In that silence, he felt so small, yet so deeply connected to everything around him. He felt that this journey, though it had begun with a desire for scientific discovery, had taken him far, far beyond anything he had ever imagined. That night, Thomas finally made a major decision. He would leave Medina with more than just an archaeological find. He had discovered something far more valuable, a new understanding of himself, of life, and of what comes after. The morning after his final conversation with Sheikh Ahmad, Thomas revealed his intentions. I want to continue this search, but now I am not just a seeker of scientific truth. I also want to find peace within myself, and perhaps I must embrace a greater truth." Sheikh Ahmed smiled, his eyes filled with wisdom. "That is the right path, Mr. Renford. Every sincere search will lead us to understand that knowledge, faith, and wisdom are inseparable." With a calmer heart, Thomas finally left Medina, leaving behind a land that had taught him more than he could have hoped. But even though he left, his search was not over. Instead, it was the beginning of a new, far deeper and broader journey toward true enlightenment. He now knew that truth is not found solely in scientific evidence or dogmatic belief. True truth lies in the deeper place between knowledge and faith, between reason and heart, and between worldly and spiritual pursuits. As his plane departed Medina, he gazed up at the vast sky, realizing that his quest, though full of questions and mysteries, had led him to a deeper understanding of who he was and what he sought. No more confusion, no more doubt. He had found enlightenment. And with that, the journey of Thomas Renford, a scientist turned truth seeker, finally reached its turning point. Among all his discoveries, he now understood that truth seeking is not about uncovering the past, but about finding peace in understanding our place in this world and in our relationship with the Almighty. Friends of the Islamic faith who are blessed by Allah, I hope this video is useful, and see you in our next video.